Craig Thompson stared at his reflection in the corporate bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the umpteenth time. He cleared his throat and practiced his lines once again. "Dad, I'd like you to meet my fiancée." He trailed off, grimacing at his own reflection. The fiancée in question was still very much non-existent, and the dinner where he was supposed to introduce her was mere hours away. His mind wandered back to the conversation with his father, Stan, just a week ago. The memory of Stan's stern face and cold, calculating eyes made Craig's stomach churn. "Craig, you're turning 30 next month," Stan had said, leaning back in his leather chair. "It's time you settled down and showed some responsibility. If you want to take over as president of Thompson Enterprises, you need to be married by your birthday. No wife, no presidency. It's as simple as that." The ultimatum had hit Craig like a ton of bricks. He had always known that his father had high expectations, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. Now, with the clock ticking, he found himself in an impossible situation. Returning to his office, Craig discreetly opened his browser and typed escort services into the search bar. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, half expecting his father to materialize behind him. As he scrolled through the results, a mix of shame and desperation washed over him. A gentle knock on his door made him jump. "Come in," he called, hastily minimizing the browser window. His best friend and colleague, Sarah, poked her head in. "Hey, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Craig ran a hand through his hair, debating whether to confide in her. Finally, he spilled everything: the ultimatum, the non-existent fiancé, and his desperate plan. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Craig, are you insane? Hiring an escort to pretend to be your fiancé? This is going to blow up in your face. What choice do I have?" Craig retorted, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's either this or kiss the presidency goodbye. It's just for one dinner. I'll figure out the rest later." Sarah shook her head, clearly unconvinced. "This is a terrible idea, but if you're really going through with it, at least be careful." After Sarah left, Craig returned to his search. He finally settled on a service that seemed discreet and professional. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number and arranged to meet one of their escorts, Eva, at a quiet cafe later that afternoon. As the appointed time approached, Craig found himself pacing outside the cafe, his palms sweaty and his heart racing. He checked his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. What if she didn't show up? What if someone recognized him? Just as he was considering backing out, a young woman approached him. "Craig?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. Craig turned, and for a moment, he forgot to breathe. Eva was nothing like he had expected. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was an authenticity about her that seemed at odds with her profession, a warmth in her eyes that immediately put him at ease. "Yes, that's me," he managed to stammer. "Shall we?" He gestured towards the cafe entrance. Once seated, Craig launched into an awkward explanation of his situation, his words tumbling out in a nervous rush. Eva listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, Eva leaned forward, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Before we go to this dinner, I have a proposal for you." Craig blinked, caught off guard. "A proposal?" "Yes." Eva nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "I want to take you to the amusement park you used to visit as a child. The one just outside the city." Craig's mouth fell open. Of all the things he had expected her to say, this wasn't even on the list. The amusement park? But why? Eva shrugged, her smile widening. "Consider it a warm-up. If we're going to convince your family we're in love, we need to create some real memories, don't you think?" Craig hesitated, glancing at his watch. There was still time before the dinner, but the idea seemed so frivolous. Risky even, yet, as he looked at Eva's expectant face, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said, surprising himself. "Let's do it." Eva's face lit up with genuine excitement. She grabbed Craig's hand, pulling him to his feet. "Come on then, we'll take the subway. It'll be faster than dealing with traffic." Before Craig could protest, Eva was dragging him out of the cafe and towards the nearest subway station. As they ran, hand in hand, Craig felt a strange mix of exhilaration and terror. What had he gotten himself into? They reached the platform just as a train was pulling in. The cars were packed with commuters, a sight that made Craig hesitate. He was used to private cars and spacious offices, not the crush of public transportation. Eva laughed at his expression, the sound light and carefree. "Don't worry, it's all part of the adventure." She tugged him into the crowded car, pressing close to make room. As the doors closed and the train lurched forward, Craig found himself wedged between Eva and a businessman engrossed in his phone. He looked down at Eva, who grinned up at him, completely at ease in the chaos. Despite his discomfort, Craig felt a smile tugging at his lips. The train picked up speed, whisking them away towards an afternoon Craig could never have anticipated. As the city blurred past the windows, neither Craig nor Eva noticed the familiar figure standing on the platform, watching their departure with a puzzled frown. Stan Thompson lowered the phone he had been about to use to call his son, his suspicions aroused by the unexpected sight. Stan Thompson stood on the metro platform, his brow furrowed in confusion as he watched his son Craig disappear into the crowded train car with a mysterious young woman. Something didn't feel right. His paternal instincts, honed over decades of business dealings, screamed that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Without hesitation, he hailed a passing taxi. "Follow that metro," Stan instructed the driver, his voice tinged with determination. As the taxi weaved through traffic, Stan's mind raced with possibilities. Who was this woman? And why hadn't Craig mentioned her before? Meanwhile, Craig and Eva emerged from the metro station, the colorful lights and cheerful sounds of the amusement park greeting them. Craig's face was a mix of apprehension and discomfort, a stark contrast to Eva's excited grin. "Come on, it'll be fun." Eva tugged on Craig's hand, pulling him towards the entrance. Craig hesitated, his polished shoes and tailored suit feeling out of place among the casual crowds. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," he muttered, but Eva's enthusiasm was infectious. Before he knew it, they were standing in line for the roller coaster, the screams of riders echoing around them. "Trust me," Eva said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "You'll love it." As they climbed into the car, Craig's heart raced, and not just from the anticipation of the ride. Eva's hand brushed against his as they lowered the safety bar, sending an unexpected jolt through him. The coaster lurched forward, and Craig gripped the bar tightly. The first drop was a rush of adrenaline and fear. Craig's scream of terror mingled with Eva's delighted laughter, the wind whipping through their hair. As they zoomed through loops and corkscrews, Craig found himself laughing too, the thrill of the ride washing away his earlier reservations. Unbeknownst to them, Stan had arrived at the park, his eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of his son. He moved through the throngs of people, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of the other parkgoers. As Craig and Eva stumbled off the roller coaster, their legs wobbly but faces flushed with excitement, Eva pulled Craig towards a cotton candy vendor. "My treat," she insisted, handing him a fluffy pink cloud of sugar. Craig took a tentative bite, the sweetness melting on his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he ate cotton candy. As he watched Eva take an enormous bite, leaving a pink mustache above her lip, he found himself smiling genuinely for the first time in what felt like ages. From a distance, Stan observed the interaction, his frown deepening. The ease and comfort between Craig and this woman seemed at odds with his son's usual demeanor. Something wasn't adding up. "Step right up. Win a prize for the lady," a carnival barker called out, drawing Eva's attention to a ring toss game. She turned to Craig with a challenging smirk. "Think you can win me that teddy bear?" she asked, pointing to a large stuffed animal hanging from the booth ceiling. Craig puffed out his chest, a competitive glint in his eye. "Watch and learn," he said confidently, handing over some cash for a set of rings. His first few throws were disastrous, the rings clattering to the ground or bouncing off the bottles. Eva stifled her giggles as Craig's face grew increasingly frustrated. "Here, let me show you," Eva said, stepping closer. She placed her hands over his, guiding his arm through the throwing motion. Craig's breath caught in his throat at the closeness, the scent of her perfume mingling with the sugary aroma of cotton candy. With Eva's guidance, Craig's next throw sailed perfectly, the rings settling around the neck of a bottle with a satisfying clink. The barker handed over the enormous teddy bear, and Craig presented it to Eva with a shy smile. My hero, Eva said dramatically, hugging the bear close. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the bustling park around them seemed to fade away. The spell was broken by Craig glancing at his watch, his eyes widening in alarm. "We should get going," he said. "The dinner." Eva nodded, but her eyes lit up as she spotted the Ferris wheel. "One last ride," she pleaded. "For good luck." Craig hesitated, but found himself unable to resist her hopeful expression. As their car ascended, the twinkling lights of the city spread out before them. The tension of the upcoming dinner melted away as they took in the breathtaking view. "Thank you for this," Craig said softly, turning to Eva. "I can't remember the last time I had this much fun." Eva's smile was warm in the dim light of their car. "Sometimes we all need a little reminder of what it's like to just enjoy life," she replied. As they descended, both lost in thought about the evening ahead, neither noticed the familiar figure waiting for them at the ride's exit. Stan stood there, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable as Craig and Eva stepped off the Ferris wheel. "Dad!" Craig's voice was filled with surprise and a hint of panic. "What are you doing here?" The tension was palpable as Stan, Craig, and Eva stood facing each other at the amusement park's exit. Craig's mind raced, desperately trying to concoct a plausible explanation for their unexpected encounter. He cleared his throat, his voice slightly shaky as he began to speak. "Dad, what a surprise! I was just showing Eva some of my favorite childhood spots before dinner. You remember how much I love this place, right?" Stan's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting between his son and the young woman beside him. "Indeed, I do," he replied, his tone measured. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Eva. I look forward to getting to know you better at dinner." The ride to the Thompson mansion was filled with awkward small talk and long silences. Eva's eyes widened as they pulled up to the grand estate, its manicured lawns, an imposing facade, a stark contrast to the whimsical amusement park they had just left. As they entered the foyer, Craig's mother rushed to greet them, her face a mix of curiosity and excitement. "Oh, Craig, you must be Eva," she exclaimed, pulling the young woman into a warm embrace. "We've been so eager to meet you." Craig's grandparents emerged from the drawing room, their eyes twinkling with interest as they were introduced to Eva. She charmed them immediately with her genuine smile and quick wit, regaling them with fabricated stories of her first date with Craig and their whirlwind romance. "So, Eva," Craig's grandmother began, "tell us about your family. Where did you grow up?" Eva didn't miss a beat. "I grew up in a small town upstate. My parents own a quaint bookshop there. It's where I developed my love for literature." As they moved to the dining room, Stan watched Eva like a hawk, his suspicion evident in every glance. The table was set with fine china and crystal, a sight that momentarily overwhelmed Eva. Craig, noticing her hesitation, discreetly guided her to her seat and whispered quick instructions about which fork to use first. The first course arrived, a delicate lobster bisque that Eva had clearly never encountered before. She watched Craig from the corner of her eye, mirroring his movements as he elegantly maneuvered his spoon. Stan seized the opportunity to begin his interrogation. "Eva, Craig mentioned you work in publishing. Which company did you say it was again?" Craig's heart raced as Eva smoothly replied, "Oh, I'm actually with a small independent press. We specialize in up-and-coming authors. It's not a well-known name, but we're passionate about what we do." The questions continued throughout the meal, each one more pointed than the last. Stan inquired about Eva's education, her career aspirations, and her family's background. With each response, Eva wove an intricate tapestry of half-truths and complete fabrications, maintaining her composure even as Craig's palms grew sweaty with anxiety. Just as Craig thought they might make it through the evening unscathed, his grandfather cleared his throat and tapped his glass for attention. "I have an announcement to make," he began, his voice commanding the room. "In light of recent developments, I've decided to accelerate the succession plan for the company." Craig choked on his wine, coughing violently as Eva patted his back. His grandfather continued, "The transfer of leadership will now take place in 1 month, not 6 as originally planned." The room fell silent, all eyes on Craig as he struggled to regain his composure. Eva, sensing his distress, discreetly reached under the table and squeezed his hand, offering silent support. Stan raised his glass, a challenging glint in his eye. Well then, let's toast to the future. To Craig and Eva, and to the bright future of Thompson Enterprises. As glasses clinked around the table, Craig and Eva exchanged a worried glance. The simple charade they had planned had suddenly become far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. As the evening drew to a close, Craig's mother insisted on giving Eva a tour of the family portrait gallery, leaving Craig to help his father and grandfather clear the table, a Thompson tradition regardless of their wealth. "You must bring Eva around again soon," Craig's mother called as they prepared to leave. "We've so enjoyed meeting her." Craig nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course, Mom. We'll plan something soon." As Craig helped Eva with her coat, relief washing over him at having survived the evening, Stan's voice cut through the air. "Craig, a word in my office before you go." Craig froze, his hand on the doorknob. He turned to Eva, whispering, "Wait for me in the car. I'll just be a moment." With a deep breath, he followed his father down the hallway, the weight of impending confrontation heavy on his shoulders. Craig's heart raced as he followed his father into the study, the heavy oak door closing behind them with an ominous thud. The room, usually a sanctuary of leather-bound books and the comforting scent of aged whiskey, now felt like a courtroom where he was about to be tried for his deception. Stan Thompson moved behind his imposing mahogany desk, his face a mask of disappointment and barely contained anger. "Sit down, Craig," he commanded, his voice low and controlled. Craig lowered himself into the chair across from his father, his palms sweaty and his mouth dry. He tried to steady his breathing, to prepare himself for whatever was coming. Stan reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder, tossing it onto the desk between them. It landed with a soft slap, and Craig's eyes were drawn to it like a moth to a flame. "Do you want to explain this to me?" Stan asked, his tone deceptively calm. With trembling hands, Craig opened the folder. His heart sank as he saw what was inside. Photographs of Eva, documents detailing her work as an escort, bank statements showing payments from various clients. His carefully constructed lie was unraveling before his eyes. "Dad, I can explain," Craig began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Explain?" Stan's voice rose sharply. "Explain how you thought you could fool your family? How you decided to bring a prostitute into our home and pass her off as your fiancée?" Craig flinched at the harsh word. "She's not. It's not like that. Eva is. Eva is a liar, just like you," Stan cut him off. "Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation? To the company?" Outside the study, Eva stood in the hallway, her ear pressed against the door. She had noticed the tension between Craig and his father and couldn't help but follow when they excused themselves. Now, as she listened to their heated exchange, her heart sank. Back inside, Craig found his voice. "Dad, please. Eva makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" Stan scoffed. "Happy? You've known her for what, a day? This isn't about happiness, Craig. This is about responsibility, about the future of our family legacy." "Maybe I don't want that legacy," Craig shot back, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Maybe I'm tired of living up to your expectations, of sacrificing everything for the almighty Thompson name." Stan's face reddened with anger. "You ungrateful. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed for this family? For you?" "Yeah, I do," Craig replied, his voice softening. "And look where it's gotten you. A loveless marriage, a son you can't connect with, and a life ruled by boardrooms and balance sheets." For a moment, Stan looked taken aback by his son's words. But then his expression hardened once more. "Enough. I'm going to make this very simple for you, Craig. It's her or your inheritance. Choose." Craig felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared at his father, searching for any sign of the man who used to take him fishing, who taught him how to ride a bike. But all he saw was a cold, calculating businessman. "Dad, please don't make me choose," Craig pleaded. "I'm not making you do anything," Stan replied. "You're a grown man. Make your decision." Outside, Eva stepped back from the door, tears streaming down her face. She had heard enough. Quietly, she made her way to the front door, pausing only long enough to scribble a note for Craig. Inside the study, Craig stood up, his decision made. "I choose Eva," he said firmly. Stan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You can't be serious." "I am," Craig replied. "I know it's only been a day, but she makes me feel alive in a way I haven't in years. I'm not going to throw that away for money or status." With that, Craig turned and walked out of the study, leaving his father sputtering behind him. But when he reached the foyer, his heart sank. Eva was gone, and in her place was a hastily written note. "Craig, I'm sorry, but I can't be the reason you lose everything. Thank you for a wonderful day. Goodbye." Eva, panic rising in his chest, Craig bolted out the front door. He spotted Eva in the distance, walking briskly down the long driveway. "Eva," he called out, running after her. Eva turned, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Craig, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Eva, wait," Craig panted as he caught up to her. "Let me explain. What you heard." "I heard enough," Eva cut him off. "I heard you having to choose between me and your entire life. I can't ask you to do that, Craig. It's not fair. But I want to," Craig insisted, reaching for her hand. "Eva, in one day, you've shown me more about life and happiness than I've experienced in years." Eva pulled her hand away, shaking her head sadly. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When you realize what you've given up? You'll resent me, Craig, and I can't bear that." Before Craig could respond, a taxi pulled up to the gates of the Thompson estate. Eva must have called it while he was still in the study. "Goodbye, Craig," Eva said softly, stepping towards the cab. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Craig watched helplessly as Eva got into the taxi and drove away, taking with her the promise of a life he had only just begun to imagine. He stood there long after the taillights had disappeared into the night, feeling more lost than he ever had before. With a heavy heart, Craig trudged back to the mansion. As he entered, his eyes fell on an old photograph hanging in the foyer. It showed his father as a young man, his arms wrapped around a woman Craig didn't recognize. It wasn't his mother. Craig's fingers trembled as he held the faded photograph, his eyes fixed on the unfamiliar woman in his father's arms. The date scrawled on the back, some 30 years ago, sent his mind reeling. Who was she? And why had he never seen this picture before? Determined to uncover the truth, Craig dove into the family's old photo albums, tucked away in a dusty corner of the mansion's attic. Hours passed as he flipped through page after page, searching for any clue that might shed light on his father's mysterious past. As dawn broke, Craig's mother found him surrounded by scattered albums and loose photographs. Concern etched across her face, she asked, "Craig, darling, what are you doing up here?" He held up the photo that had started it all. "Mom, who is this woman with Dad?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition quickly replaced by a guarded expression. "Where did you find that?" "It doesn't matter. Who is she?" His mother sighed, sinking onto an old trunk. "It was a long time ago, Craig, before your father and I were married. There were tensions in the beginning of our relationship. I always suspected there was someone else, but Stan never spoke of it." Craig leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Did Grandpa have anything to do with it?" A sad smile crossed his mother's face. "Your grandfather has always been traditional in his views, but you should speak to Margaret about this. She was your grandfather's secretary back then. If anyone knows the full story, it's her." Within the hour, Craig found himself at Margaret's modest apartment. The elderly woman's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she ushered him inside. "Mama, Craig Thompson, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Craig produced the photograph. Margaret's breath caught as she took it, her fingers tracing the outlines of the young couple. "Oh, Stanley," she whispered. "You kept it after all? Please, Margaret, I need to know what happened." The former secretary's gaze turned distant, lost in memories. "It was the summer of '93. Your father had just graduated from college, and he was so in love. Her name was Olivia. They were inseparable, always laughing, always at that amusement park." Craig's mind flashed to his own recent visit to the park with Eva, a pang of longing hitting him unexpectedly. Margaret continued, "But your grandfather, he had other plans. The company was expanding, and he needed Stanley to step up. When he found out about Olivia, well, let's just say he made it clear that Stanley had to choose between love and duty. And he chose duty, Craig finished, his voice hollow. Margaret nodded sadly. It broke them both. Stanley was never quite the same after that. Leaving Margaret's, Craig's head spun with revelations. He found himself outside the cafe where he'd first met Eva, his fingers hovering over her number in his phone. The call went straight to voicemail. Eva, it's me. Again. I need to talk to you. Please call me back. Days passed in a blur of unanswered calls and visits to Eva's old haunts. The cafe staff hadn't seen her since she quit. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. In a moment of desperation, Craig found himself at the amusement park, staring at the Ferris wheel where they'd shared that almost romantic moment. He could almost hear her laughter, feel the warmth of her hand in his. Back at the mansion, Craig's grandfather cornered him in the study. You've been distracted, boy. The succession is no small matter. Our family's legacy dash. Is that all that matters? Craig interrupted, his frustration boiling over. Legacy? What about happiness? The old man's eyes narrowed. Happiness is a luxury, Craig. Duty comes first. Later that night, unable to sleep, Craig found himself in his father's study. As he absently rifled through a drawer, his hand brushed against a false bottom. Curious, he pried it open, revealing a stack of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. His heart raced as he recognized his father's handwriting, addressing each letter to my dearest Olivia. Love, regret, and heartbreak poured from every page. The next morning, Craig confronted his father. We need to talk about Olivia. Stan's face paled. How do you dash? It doesn't matter. What matters is that you gave up on love because of some misguided sense of duty. And now you're trying to force me down the same path. Stan's shoulders sagged, the weight of decades of regret visible in every line of his face. Craig, you don't understand, Dash. No, I think I understand perfectly. Craig cut him off, turning to leave. As he stood by the window of his room, Craig caught his reflection. For a moment, he saw not himself, but the young man from the photograph, his father, full of hope and love, before duty had crushed his spirit. The parallels were undeniable and terrifying. Just then his phone buzzed. His heart leapt as he saw the name on the screen. Craig's phone rang. It was Eva, saying they needed to talk. Craig's heart raced as he approached the small cafe where he had agreed to meet Eva. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, and he wasn't sure what to expect from this encounter. As he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of coffee and pastries wafted over him, but did little to calm his nerves. He spotted Eva immediately, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of apprehension and something else he couldn't quite read. Craig took a deep breath and sat down across from her. Hi, he said softly, his voice barely audible above the ambient chatter of the cafe. Eva nodded in response, her eyes never leaving his face. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Finally, Eva broke the silence. Craig, I need to tell you something, she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. That night we met, it was my last job as an escort. Craig's eyebrows shot up in surprise. What do you mean? Eva took a sip of her coffee before continuing. I had already decided to leave that life behind. Meeting you, it wasn't planned. It was supposed to be my farewell to that world. As she spoke, Craig's mind flashed back to their first encounter. He remembered how different Eva had seemed from anyone he'd ever met, how she had challenged him and pushed him out of his comfort zone. It all made sense now. I'm so sorry, Eva, Craig said, leaning forward. I should have defended you to my father. I was a coward, and I let you down. Eva's eyes softened slightly. I understand why you didn't. But Craig, it hurt. I felt used and discarded, even though she trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Even though what? Craig prompted gently. Eva hesitated before answering. Even though I was starting to have real feelings for you. Beyond the job, beyond the pretense. And that scared me. Craig's heart leapt at her words. Eva, I need you to know that my feelings for you are real too. What started as a desperate plan turned into something I never expected. You've shown me a side of life I never knew existed, and I don't want to go back to the way things were before." As Craig spoke, across town, Stan Thompson sat alone in his study, surrounded by old photographs and memories. He picked up a faded picture of himself as a young man, arm in arm with a beautiful woman who wasn't his wife. With trembling hands, he reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in decades. "Hello," a voice answered. "Marie?" Stan's voice cracked. It's Stan." There was a long pause on the other end. "I'm sorry," the voice finally replied. "Marie passed away last month." The phone slipped from Stan's grasp, clattering to the floor as the weight of lost opportunities crashed down upon him. Back at the cafe, Craig and Eva were discussing the possibility of a fresh start. "I'm scared, Craig," Eva admitted. "Your world is so different from mine. How could this ever work?" Craig reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. "I don't care about my world, Eva. I care about you. If I had to choose between you and any inheritance or position, I'd choose you every time." Eva's eyes widened at his declaration. Craig slowly moved to take her hand, but she hesitated, pulling back slightly. "I need time to think," Eva said softly. "This is all happening so fast." Craig nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." Eva stood up, gathering her bag. "Thank you for meeting me, Craig, and for being honest." As she turned to leave, Craig called out, "Eva?" She paused, looking back at him. "I meant what I said. Every word." Eva gave him a small smile, then walked out of the cafe, leaving Craig with a mixture of hope and anxiety swirling in his chest. As Eva's figure disappeared down the street, Craig's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, surprised to see his grandfather's name on the screen. Craig's phone rang. It was his grandfather, requesting an urgent meeting with the entire family. The Thompson family converged on the mansion, an air of tension and curiosity hanging over them like a thick fog. Craig's grandfather had summoned them all for an urgent meeting, and as they filed into the grand living room, exchanging nervous glances, it was clear that something momentous was about to unfold. Once everyone was seated, the elderly patriarch cleared his throat, his usually commanding voice now tinged with a hint of vulnerability. "I've called you all here today because there's something important I need to share," he began, his eyes scanning the faces of his loved ones. "The truth is, I'm gravely ill. The doctors, they don't give me much time." The room fell silent, the weight of his words crushing the air out of everyone's lungs. Craig's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Stan, Craig's father, sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief and barely contained emotion. "That's why I've been pushing so hard for the succession to happen quickly," the old man continued, his gaze lingering on Craig. "I wanted to make sure everything was in order before." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications hung heavy in the air, suffocating and inescapable. Craig, his mind reeling from the revelation, suddenly felt a surge of emotion bubbling up inside him. All the frustration, the pressure, the lies, it all came rushing to the surface. Before he could stop himself, he was on his feet, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "Is this what it's all about?" he demanded, his eyes darting from his grandfather to his father. "Keeping up appearances? Maintaining traditions at any cost? What about happiness? What about love?" Stan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing at his son's outburst. "Craig, this isn't the time, Dash." "No, Dad," Craig interrupted, his voice rising. "This is exactly the time. I know about your past. I know about the love you gave up to take over the company." The room collectively held its breath. Craig's mother turned to Stan, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of betrayal. "What is he talking about, Stan?" Stan, caught off guard, struggled to maintain his composure. His usual authoritative demeanor crumbled under the weight of long-buried secrets. It was a long time ago," he stammered, avoiding his wife's gaze. Craig pressed on, the floodgates of emotion now wide open. "You gave up someone you loved because Grandpa pressured you, didn't you? And now you're trying to force me down the same path of misery." The old man, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of sadness and resignation, finally spoke up. "It's true," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I did pressure Stan. I thought I was doing what was best for the family, for the company. But I was wrong." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Craig's mother, tears welling in her eyes, turned to Stan. "All these years, why didn't you ever tell me?" Stan, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbling, buried his face in his hands. "I thought I was protecting you. Protecting all of us? I convinced myself that duty and responsibility were more important than love." Craig, his anger giving way to a profound sadness, looked at his father with new eyes. "But at what cost, Dad? Look at us. Look at this family. We're successful, sure. But are we happy?" His grandmother, who had been silently observing until now, spoke up. Her voice was soft but carried the weight of decades of wisdom. "I too made difficult choices in my youth," she revealed, her eyes misting over with memories. "I understand the pull of duty, the weight of expectations. But I've learned that true happiness comes from following your heart, not your wallet." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed her words. Craig's grandfather, looking older and more vulnerable than ever, nodded slowly. "Your grandmother is right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The true succession I wanted wasn't about the company at all. It was about values, about learning from our mistakes." Stan, visibly shaken, finally looked up at his son. "Craig, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I've been so focused on the future of the company that I forgot about the future of our family, of your happiness." The admission hung in the air, a turning point that seemed to shift the very foundation of the Thompson family. Craig, overwhelmed by the revelations and raw emotions, felt a sudden clarity wash over him. He knew what he had to do. Without a word, he turned and headed for the door, ignoring the confused calls of his family behind him. His mind was set on one thing, one person who had shown him what truly mattered in life. As he reached for the doorknob, he heard his father's voice, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Craig, where are you going?" Craig paused, his hand on the door. He turned back to face his family, a determined glint in his eye. "I know what I need to do," he said simply, before disappearing into the night, leaving his stunned family to grapple with the aftermath of their shared revelations. Craig burst through the mansion's heavy oak doors, ignoring the chorus of voices calling after him. His mind was set on one thing only: finding Eva. The cool night air hit his face as he sprinted down the driveway, fumbling for his car keys. "Eva, please pick up," he muttered, phone pressed to his ear as he peeled out of the driveway. The call went straight to voicemail for the umpteenth time. Craig's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, weaving through the late-night traffic with reckless abandon. His first stop was Eva's old workplace, the high-end escort agency tucked away in a discreet office building. Craig's heart sank as he approached the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and an impassive expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but Eva no longer works here," she said, her voice cool and professional. "And even if she did, we don't give out personal information about our employees." Craig ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. "Please, it's important. I need to find her." The receptionist's expression softened slightly. "Look, all I can say is that she left to pursue other opportunities. That's all I know." Defeated, Craig trudged back to his car. As he sat behind the wheel, memories of Eva flooded his mind. Her laugh as they rode the roller coaster, the way her eyes lit up when he won her that ridiculous stuffed bear, the warmth of her hand in his as they walked through the park. He shook his head, trying to focus. Where could she be? Meanwhile, back at the Thompson mansion, Stan sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched before him. His wife entered quietly, her face a mixture of concern and lingering hurt. "Stan," she said softly, "I think it's time we talked about what happened all those years ago." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing for our family, for the company. But now, seeing Craig, I realize how wrong I was." As they began the long overdue conversation, Craig was frantically scrolling through his contacts, trying to think of anyone who might know Eva's whereabouts. A name caught his eye: Tom, the barista from the cafe where he'd first met Eva. It was a long shot, but he had to try. The call connected, and Tom's sleepy voice answered. "Hello, Tom, it's Craig. Craig Thompson. I met Eva at your cafe. I know this is crazy, but do you have any idea where she might be working now?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Man, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Eva's my friend, and she seemed pretty torn up about you. Last I heard, she got a job at that new bookstore on 5th Street. Turning over a new leaf, I think it's called." Craig's heart leaped. "Tom, you're a lifesaver." "Thank you." The tires screeched as Craig made a sharp U-turn, heading for 5th Street. The bookstore's lights were still on as he pulled up, hope surging through him. He burst through the door, startling the few remaining customers. "Eva," he called out, scanning the aisles frantically. A puzzled employee approached him. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm looking for Eva. Does she work here?" The employee nodded slowly. "She does, but she left about 10 minutes ago. Said she needed some air." Craig's shoulders slumped. He was always one step behind. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a flash of familiar brown hair through the window. Without thinking, he dashed out of the store and down the street. "Eva," he shouted, pushing through the evening crowd. But as he rounded the corner, the woman turned, revealing a face that wasn't Eva's. Craig stopped, panting, the weight of disappointment crushing him. He found himself in front of the amusement park where it all began. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its lights twinkling like stars. Craig slumped onto a nearby bench, burying his face in his hands. His phone rang, startling him. It was his grandfather. "Craig, my boy," the old man's voice was gentle. "Your father told me what happened. I want you to know that I'm proud of you for following your heart." "But Grandpa, I've lost her." Craig's voice cracked. "I've searched everywhere." "Listen to me, Craig. In my long life, I've learned that true love has a way of finding its path. Trust your instincts. Where does your heart tell you she might be?" As his grandfather's words sank in, Craig had a sudden realization. He knew exactly where Eva would go. "Thanks, Grandpa. I think I know where to find her," he said, already on his feet. The sky darkened ominously as Craig raced towards the cafe where he and Eva had first met. Fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. By the time Craig reached the cafe, he was drenched, his expensive suit clinging to his body. He burst through the door, his eyes scanning the empty tables. His heart sank. The cafe was deserted. Deflated, Craig collapsed into a chair, water dripping from his hair onto the polished tabletop. He had been so sure, so certain that Eva would be here. As the rain pounded against the windows, Craig felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him. Just then, the bell above the door chimed. Craig looked up, his breath catching in his throat. The door of the cafe opened, and Eva walked in, equally drenched, looking at Craig with surprise in her eyes. The bell above the cafe door chimed as Eva stepped inside, her clothes dripping from the sudden downpour. She shook her umbrella, closed it, and looked up, her eyes widening in surprise as they met Craig's. For a moment, she stood frozen, her hands still on the door handle, contemplating whether to stay or flee. Craig's heart raced as he saw her, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over him. "Eva, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't go. Just hear me out." Eva hesitated, her gaze darting between Craig and the door. The rain outside intensified, as if nature itself was urging her to stay. With a deep breath, she nodded slightly and made her way to Craig's table. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows filling the void between them. Craig's fingers nervously tapped against his coffee mug, while Eva's eyes remained fixed on the table's worn surface. Finally, Craig broke the silence, his voice thick with emotion. "Eva, I don't even know where to begin." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "These past few days have been a whirlwind, and I've realized something important." As Craig spoke, memories of their time together flashed through both their minds. The laughter on the roller coaster, the shared cotton candy, the tender moment on the Ferris wheel, all these images overlapped with their current tense situation. Eva lifted her gaze, meeting Craig's eyes. "Craig, I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Your world is so different from mine. I don't know if I belong there." Craig leaned forward, his eyes never